Alpine University's October webinar. Our topic today is Don't Fear the Audit. My name is Jana Hairston, and I'll be serving as your moderator today, and I work here on the marketing team at Alpine. We'll get our content started in just a couple of moments, but before we do get started, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. If you find value in attending today's webinar, make sure that you register for our November webinar. That next webinar will be held on November the 10th, and we'll be talking about item development. If you have any questions throughout the presentation today, we will be allowing time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. And so to get those questions answered, please post them in the questions drop-down menu. And then during the Q&A session, I'll read out the questions to our presenters, and they'll have the opportunity to answer your questions. Make sure when you post those questions to send all rather than selecting individual presenters. If you're having any technical problems with the webinar, please close down and restart the application. If that does not work, you can get in touch with the folks at GoToWebinar support at 855-352-9002, and I'll shortly post a link in the chat drop-down that gives you access to support services. So last but not least, before we get started, we'll be covering a lot of information today, but don't worry because we're recording the session. So if you miss something, you can always review it once the presentation has been posted to the Alpine Testing Solutions website. We'll also send out an email within a couple of days with a link to the recording and the entire slide deck for your use. So we'll get started, and our presenters today are Drew Wiley, Alpine's Director of Education Services, and we also have Tracy Hembry, who is a psychometrician here at Alpine. And with that, I'll turn it over to Drew and Tracy.
Thanks very much, and welcome to everyone who has joined, and thank you for participating today. I'm sure the topic of audit was a big draw for all of you. Who doesn't want to spend their lunch hour sitting and talking about audits? Drew and I, as Jana mentioned, work within the education group at Alpine, and we've recently completed several audits, and each of them was pretty different. And so we thought that this would be a good time to share out the information about our experiences, share information about the audit process with all of you. It's important to note that while Drew and I work primarily in education, Alpine has conducted audits for various industries, including professional licensure and IT certification, among others. And so a lot of our work will be grounded in our experiences in education, but the key characteristics of an audit that we're going to discuss today will apply across industries. So I have set a personal goal for myself for this webinar to put the term audit in a new light for all of you. So it's not just about finances in the IRS. So we're going to talk about audits in a different context today, and it doesn't always have to have a negative connotation. Believe it or not, an audit in the context of a testing program can actually be beneficial and positive rather than painful. So that's what we'll talk about today, and hopefully by the end of this you won't think about an audit perhaps a little less negatively when it comes to the context of a testing program. So the topics that we'll cover today include what is an audit when it comes to a testing program, what does an audit include, how is it done, and even why is it done. So let's jump right in. What does it mean to conduct an audit for a testing program? So an audit of a testing program is like what's done with taxes in that it's an independent review. So an audit entails having an independent person or organization come in and review work that either has already been completed or perhaps plans of work that's yet to come. And the idea here is that you have an independent group who has no stake in the game or investment within the program to provide the review of the work. And it's that unbiased viewpoint that adds to the program itself and adds some benefit. So a testing program audit isn't completely unrelated to what's done with taxes, but I'd like to think that we're a little bit nicer than the IRS. And I actually ran across an article this morning that referred to an audit within the field of education and referred to the auditing organization as a watchdog. And so I hope at the end of this you don't think of Alpine in that context. Hopefully you think of us as a little bit nicer than that. So a little bit more detail about a testing program audit. I think the key from this is that you don't want to come in and have a prescribed process that's followed across all programs. Really, an audit should be customized to the needs of a program and customized to the needs of you as a client. So what you wouldn't want, say you work within the field of IT certification, it wouldn't be all that beneficial for you if Drew and I came in and followed the exact same process and procedures that we used for an audit in education to your program. Rather, what you want is for the audit process to be customized to your needs and the goals of your audit. So really the first step of an audit is for the group conducting the audit or review and the owner of the testing program to sit down and have a lot of discussion to outline the purpose of the assessments, the ways in which the scores were used, and the goals of the audit. And from there, that really drives forward the audit itself and helps the reviewer customize the audit to your needs. So on screen, what you see are a few ways in which an audit can vary and be customized to a program. So an audit can be focused on a specific aspect of a program. So let's say, for example, you've got an upcoming standard setting and you've outlined all the plans for that process, and you're interested in having a third party come in and just provide some input on the plans that you've made. So that would be an example of a focused review. Alternatively, an audit could be comprehensive in nature and inclusive of all areas of a program. Another way in which audits can be different is that in some cases they're done formatively, meaning that they're done during the development of an assessment or a program, or they can be done in a more summative nature after a program has been up and running for some time. An audit can focus on one assessment, on a group of assessments, or on a program as a whole and be done at a program level. It can also be done once or can be done periodically to provide ongoing feedback about a program. An audit can be informal in nature, where you really just have a handful of key staff who are involved and working directly with the reviewers. In comparison, it can be much more formal, where you have governing bodies or legislators involved in overseeing the work and the outcomes of the audit. I think perhaps more commonly, audits tend to be internal in nature, where the information is shared within the company itself. But sometimes the outcomes of an audit can also be used to support public-facing efforts, things like accreditation, or in other cases, outcomes may be documented in a report that's posted on a website and available for various stakeholders. So these are just a few ways in which an audit can vary and be customized to the needs of a program. And you can imagine that there are several other ways that I could have mentioned as well, ways in which an audit can vary and be different based on the needs of the program. And you can imagine that with all of the various possible combinations, you end up with each audit being very unique. So the key is that there really just isn't a one-size-fits-all solution or process for conducting an audit. It really should be driven by the basis of the assessment program itself and the goals of the audit. So what you see on screen are all of the possible aspects of a program that could be included within an audit. As I mentioned, because an audit could be specific in nature or could be more comprehensive, any or all aspects of these areas of a program can be included. So it may be that an audit is only going to be done once, it's a one-time deal, and the goal for that audit is for it to be very comprehensive in nature. So in that case, all of the applicable aspects of the program here could be included. Maybe in the case of an ongoing audit, where the reviewers come in annually, it may be that only one or two aspects of the program are reviewed annually. And so the reviewers and the owners of the program work together to kind of prioritize the order in which the various aspects of the programs are included within the review. Yet another case, Phil, may be that you've heard of a specific concern in regards to your program. So for example, maybe internally or even externally, you've heard some concerns raised about the content of an assessment or the items on the assessment. And so in that case, a review wouldn't include or entail many of the aspects of the program that are in this bulleted list, and rather it would focus in on the development efforts and alignment of the work to the standards. So that would be a case of a much more focused audit. So again, there isn't just one way to do it, and it really should be driven by the needs and goals of the audit and the needs and goals of the program itself. You don't want someone to come in and follow some prescribed process and just check a lot of boxes, because you may find that they wouldn't all apply to your specific program. So there are a number of reasons why an audit may come about and may be done for a program. We have some experiences with some cases where it was actually required. So there are some testing programs and some contracts where having a third-party independent reviewer come in and review either one aspect or several aspects of a program is written into the contract. We've also experienced a case, and we'll talk about this example later, where an audit was actually legislatively mandated. So those are examples of where an audit is a requirement. So there's no, actual discussion about should we do one or not. It's written in from the beginning that that's a part of the program. But for other programs, there are a variety of reasons why an audit or program review may be conducted. So a program may be interested in having an independent check of the program as part of enacting a system of checks and balances. And so an audit is a great way of adding in a check and balance to the program by having that independent review. In other cases, a program may want to add to the credibility or defensibility of the program or the assessment. And so again, having someone independently come in who has no stakes in the assessment and providing feedback on the program really can add to that credibility. We've also encountered some programs that were developed years ago and have been running relatively smoothly ever since. So things are, all is well. But a program review can be helpful in identifying ways in which to conduct ongoing maintenance of the program. So maybe a few years have passed and you realize that this program should probably garner some attention. And so by having someone come in and conducting an audit, that'll help you identify which specific aspects of the program garner some attention and maintenance, and when to do those actions as well. Finally, we've had other clients who are actively looking to improve an existing program. But it may be that they're not really sure how to do that. So what does it mean to make improvements to my program? I'm not sure how to make it better. And so an audit comes in and helps identify ways in which to efficiently focus resources and time to make improvements and kind of get the most bang for their buck in terms of the resources that are available to make improvements. So again, the ways in which an audit comes about and the reason for reviewing a program can really vary. Again, we'll talk through some examples that will help illustrate that. Despite the fact that each audit is unique and includes different aspects, we have found that there are some commonalities in conducting an audit, some steps that seem to really apply across situations and circumstances. So the first step is really to define the scope. And I mentioned this earlier in regards to having the group that's doing the review or audit, as well as the owner of the program, sit down together and have some conversation at the onset of the project. And this is really important. So again, this is where you should discuss the purpose of the program itself and the assessments, the ways in which the scores are used, as well as the goals of the audit. So what are you hoping to gain from the audit? Why are you doing it? And so having those conversations early on is really important, and I think all of the details of the audit flow from these initial conversations and define the scope and deliverables for the project. So once the scope of the audit or the program review is defined, typical first step in the process is just to begin with information sharing. And so usually this involves the owners of the assessment or the program sharing a large number of documents with the reviewers. We kindly refer to this as a document dump. And so this is a matter of just pulling any and all available documents that you have that you feel would be relevant and passing those along to the reviewers for them to start to dig through. Another important step in the process that we commonly do is to supplement the documentation. We set up meetings and interviews with various key staff and stakeholders. So these conversations are important for a number of reasons. Oftentimes documentation may still be in process or hasn't yet begun or isn't complete or is outdated. That's all extremely common. And so having these additional conversations provides the supplemental information to kind of fill in the gaps of the existing documents and provide the full information about the program. Another way in which these conversations are pretty vital is that it provides a lot of the contextual information for the program. So as I'm sure all of you know, a program doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are the dynamics within your organization. There are the dynamics and constraints that come from the industry within which you work. And so all of those are really relevant and important to the reviewers to understand at the onset to really frame the review accurately. And so these interviews and conversations with stakeholders and staff help illuminate that context and help guide the review that follows. Another thing that we found is that during this information sharing process, what commonly happens is that the reviewers will identify additional questions or information that are actually relevant to the audit. So this process becomes iterative, where you put forward documents, share them with the reviewers, they spend some time with them, have some conversations, and ask for additional information and ask additional questions. So this is a back and forth that tends to go on for most of the audit process to gather as much information as possible and get complete information about the program. As information is collected, the real key activity of an audit is to compare the work that was done or is planned to be done to the relevant standards or industry best practices. So it's important to note here that an audit shouldn't just be based on the personal judgments of the reviewers. So they don't get to, based on their own ideas, decide what's good and what's bad. Instead, all of the work of an audit should be grounded in these industry standards. So based on peer-reviewed and published guidelines, you want to see how the work that's been done compares to what's considered standard. So this is another place where having that contextual information is really important because it's impossible for a program from start to finish to be done by the book, so to speak. So you encounter constraints along the way that influence the decision-making for the program and the way in which things are done. And so you want your reviewers to be aware of that context so that when they're making this comparison of what you did versus what was done or what's outlined in the standards, they understand the context and the constraints which you were facing. The final steps of the audit are to document the findings and share out the results. And again, this is going to be done according to the needs of the program and the goals of the audit. And so this should really be outlined up in that first step where you're defining the scope of the process. Part of those discussions should also include what the deliverables for the project should be, how the information is going to be shared. So it may be that what you need is for the reviewers to come in and present the results one time with a presentation just to a handful of internal staff. Or maybe what you need is some kind of formal report that you share with staff, but then also share with some external stakeholders. So all of this is typically outlined from the onset of the program, and then you just follow through at the end. One thing that I want to expand on a little bit is the mention of the audit work being grounded in industry standards and best practice. So again, not based on the opinions of the reviewers, instead based on these standards. And so what you'll see here is just a list of some standards that we've used in the past in conducting these audits. So the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing is a document that covers a lot of industries, not all, but a lot, and provides guidance in the development and administration of testing programs. Accreditation standards, we can also turn to those as well if they're relevant to your industry. And it may be that within your specific industry there are industry-specific standards that should also be referenced as well, and so those can be included in the process. Another important point here to note is that these standards don't outline all of the details of all of the aspects of the development of a program. If they did, they would be huge documents. Rather, they provide guidelines at a higher level of the work that should be done. And so we refer to these standards to get that guidance, and then when it comes to more details, that's where we would turn to psychometric text on specific topics. So for example, the standards may provide you with some information about how to communicate results from standard setting. So that's kind of at a high level. But the details for the various methods that could be used to conduct standard setting and how those should be done would be found within text focused solely on standard setting. Believe it or not, there are textbooks just on standard setting or just on equating. And so those text and references would be used as well within an audit for the various aspects of the program. So thus far, I've spent a lot of time talking about how every audit is different and how they're customized to the needs of the program. And so because there's so much variety, we thought it might be helpful to walk through some examples and to illustrate what an audit looks like for a testing program in a number of different circumstances. So we're going to walk through a couple of those. Keep in mind, as I mentioned before, that these examples come from our experience, both Drew's and mine, in the area of education. But we have done audits in other industries as well. And hopefully the way in which we present these examples highlights characteristics of the audits that really apply across a number of settings. So the first one that we'll talk about is one that we conducted this summer for the Florida Standards Assessments. So these are the statewide student assessments for math and English language arts within the state of Florida. These assessments are high stakes for students, teachers, schools, and districts. The scores are used to make decisions like grade promotion and graduation eligibility for students, to determine raises for teachers, and provide ratings and determine funding for schools and districts. So with these particular assessments, they were administered for the first time last year, 2014-15, and they were using a new vendor. Some of the assessments were delivered via paper, specifically those for the younger grade levels, but many of them were administered on computer. Florida's made a concerted effort to move much of their testing onto computer for their students. So this audit came about for a number of reasons, one of which, and probably the primary reason, being that during the administration of the assessments this past spring, there were some challenges to the computer-based administrations. So the systems encountered some difficulties. There were some cyber attacks on the system that impacted the students' ability to take the test. And so for those of you who don't work within education, you may have heard anyway or seen press about high-stakes testing of students. And certainly this topic has garnered a lot of scrutiny in recent years. So there was a lot of attention paid to these challenges that came up during the administration. There was a fair amount of press coverage of it. And then coincidentally, the Florida legislature was also in session at the same time as these test administrations were going on and these challenges were encountered. And so the legislators decided that what they wanted was to have an independent investigation regarding the validity of the assessment program. And so they actually wrote that into a law that was passed. And in addition to that, the legislators decided that until the results of this investigation were released, that the state would not be reporting the results of the assessments or using the test scores. So pretty much all of the reporting from these assessments from the spring was put on hold until this audit was conducted. The state of Florida was pretty specific in terms of the scope of the audit. They wanted the audit to include 6 specific studies that evaluated things from the actual test items and alignment of the items to the standards, through field testing, administration, various psychometric activities like scaling and equating. So all in all, it was a pretty comprehensive audit that they were looking for. And for a comprehensive audit, the 3-month timeline would be considered pretty aggressive. Although because they put everything on hold in regards to this program, reporting of the scores, it was understandable that they wanted to get the work done as quickly as possible. So this is what we spent our time doing for 3 months this past summer. Outlined within the work with Florida from the beginning were a number of deliverables. Every month we had to turn into the state a monthly progress report that outlined the work that we completed during that month. In addition, we provided a comprehensive report that addressed each of the studies, as well as overall program recommendations, commendations, and conclusions. All of the reports that we provided to the state were made available to the public, so it was imperative that the reports be written to address a variety of stakeholders. So within the report, we included an executive summary for those people who were interested in just knowing the bottom line. What did you find? What's the outcome of the investigation? And then within the body of the report, which is somewhere over 180 pages, we outlined all of the details of the technical work as well. So all of those details were included in the report that we provided. In addition to these deliverables, and I think perhaps because of the stakes associated with this work, there has been some follow-up that we've participated in. Drew had the pleasure of traveling to Florida last month to speak to the Florida Senate Education Committee. So after the report was released, the committee reviewed the report and had some questions both about the work that we did and the findings within the report. So Drew participated in that. In addition, there's an organization in Florida called the Florida Educational Research Association, and they meet annually, and they'll be meeting again in November, and they've asked for us to come participate in that meeting and share some information about this report and the findings. So as an example of an audit, I would say that this one was one time but very comprehensive in nature. The stakes were, I think, probably higher than what is typical for an audit or for the audits that we tend to see. It was also unique to have all of the information shared publicly and for all of the coverage and attention that this work received. I would say that that's unique in nature. And as we go through the next 2 examples, you'll see how this example contrasts with some of the other work that we've done that may be a little bit more typical. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Drew to talk through the next two examples.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I appreciate it. As Tracy mentioned, the work that we were doing in Florida was very interesting, and we should point out that one of the things about Florida that we forgot to put into the slides, and I realized it as Tracy was walking through it, is we did have a very valuable partner in the work that we did with Florida. That was EdCount, who did an awful lot of the work with us. And so sometimes in these type of scenarios, with the challenge on resources that you have and timelines, we have found that by partnering with people like EdCount, who can kind of come in, we were able to address all of the issues that cropped up, which quite frankly, in the 3-month time frame, we would not have been able to do solely on our own. And I think one of the reasons why the time frame for Florida was such a challenge was, as Tracy was describing, the public dissemination and the fact that every report, we would send a report to Florida at 4:45 on a Friday, and by Saturday afternoon, traditionally it was up on the Florida website, and we were getting phone calls about it by Monday. So there was an awful lot of kind of public view of that. In contrast, some of the other groups that we have worked with have been a little bit less in the public domain. And let me see if I can just scroll down. For some reason, I am not going down on the slides. Tracy, would it be possible for you to just page down? Great. Thank you. I think it'll be pretty clear when I kind of need to move to slides, and I don't have that many. So in contrast to what we did with Florida, we have also done some work with some major educational publishers who have done work and who have assessments as part of their programs. And one of the clear differences, as you can see, we don't even have the name of the publisher, is this work is traditionally done in a kind of a confidential fashion, where the reports, the information, everything about the procedures are done solely for the purposes of the test publisher, the organization, the company, and the documents that are shared, the reports that are written by Alpine are never shared publicly or anything like that. And we traditionally don't even talk about who it is that we're working with. There have been some scenarios where we have talked about specific groups that we've worked with or organizations that we've worked with, but we usually try to avoid talking about the specific results that we find, for example, or the specific recommendations that we find. So some of what I'll talk about here will be a little bit more general than you would see, but that's simply because we've got to respect the confidentiality throughout this entire process. So the publisher that we are working with does work more on the low-stakes student assessment type of model. Now, anytime you put the term low stakes into a slide like this, you'll always kind of cause a little bit of a flag, because from the test user's perspective, there really is no such thing as a low-stakes student assessment. But on the other hand, I think the publisher that we were working with was primarily developing assessments to help students in placement into remediation, for example, or for assistance in their curriculum and things like that. So there was not graduation decisions being made on using these assessments. And so I do think that it had slightly lower assessments, lower stakes, and I think that's important because that does influence how you take a look at the test standards and the procedures that are being followed. As Tracy mentioned, one of the critical components of this type of work is understanding the nature of the assessment program and being able to apply the best practices, the test standards that are out there, and being able to apply them appropriately given the demands of each unique program. And so you're going to see different things in Florida than you will see with these publishers. And that's perfectly fine given the competing demands of what's happening. The assessments here were all online assessments, focused primarily on math and reading, and they were adaptive assessments. The work that we've been doing with this group has been kind of two-tiered. We did some work with them on math, and then we've also done some work looking at their reading assessments. So I'll talk about those as being two slightly different projects as I kind of walk through this. With math, the issue kind of initially cropped up, and they initially started working with us because they were getting kind of concerns being raised by the field. And so schools who were using their programs were saying, hey, something seems different. The student scores don't seem quite the same as what we've seen in the past. Is there something funny going on? Is there something unusual going on? Whereas in the reading, it was things were good, things were happy, and people were content, but there was a desire to kind of have that independent review that Tracy alluded to and kind of take advantage of the fact that someone could come in and look across all of their assessments to see the strengths and weaknesses of their reading programs. So for math, when we started looking at math, one of the things that we did, if you would just scroll down, is we really focused on first identifying the nature of the concerns. As I'm sure all of you have experienced, if you start getting concerns about the kind of the quote-unquote performance of a test, that feedback is not usually particularly specific. There may be a concern saying, hey, the scores seem wrong, the scores seem like they're not consistent. So you kind of have these vague concerns that were being raised. And so at the very beginning of the process, we really had to spend some time understanding from the customers, from the group that we were working with, the specific nature of the concerns that were being raised. Once we understood that, we knew we had to focus specifically on the way the test was being developed for the math test. And so we spent an awful lot of time on a very focused review of the CAT algorithm, the computer adaptive test, the algorithm that derives the adaptive nature of the test. And so for this particular publisher, we really just sat down looking at that algorithm, mapped out options for them, looked at how the item bank was working with the adaptive algorithm, and at the end of the process, we really went through and just said, okay, if you want to make changes to how your math CAT algorithm works, here are the 4 or 5 top options that will have an impact on how your test is performing, and here's kind of the downstream impact of these changes. And so we literally just went through each of those options with them, and as far as dissemination, we just kind of walked through with the management of this organization and kind of explained how these changes would have an impact on their kind of for their end user. So in some ways, we were playing the role of psychometric translator for them because we went through into the kind of the nitty-gritty psychometrics of the algorithm and came back and said, okay, if you want to make these changes, these will address the concerns that are being raised by your clients, and these are how they would address them. These are the type of impacts that they would have. So that's what we were focused on when we were talking about math. On the other hand, when we looked at reading, I think we were going through a little bit more of a comprehensive process with them and a little bit of a, let's take a look at the overall state of the reading assessments and see if we can identify the strengths and weaknesses of the program. So for example, we were looking at the item banks that were available and whether or not the item banks were sufficient for the given programs. We looked at the internal processes that were being followed. Anytime a change request was being received, anytime new changes had to be implemented, we walked through with them what procedures were available, what documentation was available, what approvals were done, and who gave those approvals. And so we kind of walked through a little bit of a process management with them to see if we could identify whether or not those procedures were sufficient or whether they were appropriate. And then we looked at just the performance of the test itself, how the scores are calculated, how they're reported, if there are cut scores, how those cut scores were determined, and how those associated cut scores and performance on the test were reported back to the students. And so for the reading assessments, the primary motivation for them was to just try to take a look and say, okay, are there any kind of outstanding or problematic things that, for example, we are missing? And so they wanted someone to come in and help them identify anything that might be cause for concern in their assessments, just because they have been kind of going through, working well, and people were happy with the assessments, but they had not really taken an opportunity in quite a long time to take this independent review to see if they could identify anything. And so because of that, when we talked about a report with them, we came back and we said, okay, going through all of these procedures, here are some key strengths that you can probably take advantage of. here are some areas that you probably don't have to worry about, which is obviously going to be a critical thing for them to know about. And just as importantly, here are some areas that these are high priority things that could be a problem immediately. These are some lower priority things that perhaps longer term you could address going through the process, and also some sense of the scope of addressing some of these issues. So this is high priority and very low investment as far as time and resources, and so these are things that could be addressed immediately. On the other hand, this is a low priority, but the amount of investment that would be involved would be exceptionally high. And so we tried to give them some sense of short and long-term things that we thought that would be appropriate for them to address, but then also kind of the resource high and low resource estimates that they would be required as far as going through that. So that's the work that we did recently with a publisher. And on the other hand, we've also done some work fairly recently with an online education provider. And in this case, the concern that was brought to us was not a concern that was driven by customers or clients or people being raising issues around the assessments. Instead, the program itself said, you know, we haven't taken the opportunity to focus very specifically on security. We provide educational services. We have students taking our assessments, but we do have certain security protocols in there. But we haven't looked at them recently, and we have not taken the opportunity to kind of put them through the ringer, if you will, to see if there were any issues with their security or any concerns that they might have. So when we were thinking about security for this given provider, the way we were kind of loosely grouped things together was just saying, we're going to look at the activities around prevention that are done, the activities around detection, and then finally the issues around enforcement for them. So more specifically, when we started going through and we started talking about prevention, for example, the type of things that we were looking at is how are your assessments developed? Who is involved in that process? If there are vendors involved, what kind of contractual requirements do they have? What kind of training is done with the vendors, with any employees who have access to confidential, secure materials? And so we were looking at, or we were trying to look at all the different steps that this organization had introduced to just prevent materials from getting out or being shared with students. And so one thing that can happen when you're going through a development process, in particular with an education provider, is people who are involved in the classes, people who are involved with the students could somehow be kind of affiliated with the development of the assessments at the same time. So you don't have kind of real great separation between the developers versus the users, and you have kind of this fuzzy group. And so the procedures that are done with anybody is going to be absolutely critical, and making sure that you understand what kind of sign-off that anybody involved in the development is required to complete is absolutely essential. And in addition to the training that is done at the initial kind of sign-off of individuals, there's also a requirement that there is kind of continuous monitoring of this. And so all of the activities around the individuals at the organization were going to be a critical part of what we were looking at as far as the prevention. But then also all of those activities at given vendors were also going to be a critical part. And so we looked at contracts and took a look at that to see if those had kind of all of the requirements as far as data protection and things like that. We then also looked at the administration practices for the given organization. They had a lot of different models, from students taking the tests online, from the students coming into a test center. And so we looked at all of those different procedures, who was involved, the sign-off that was involved, and all of the protocols there. Looking at the detection and enforcement, there we were very focused on the procedures that were in place, but also what we found is critical that we look at is not just the practices that were in place, but also how they get implemented. So for example, a lot of people out there have web crawling practices where they look and see if material is out or has been shared and things like that. And so that's fairly easy to get done What is not so easy is the processes within the organization for now using that information. I think too often people will get the information, give it a cursory review, but never really use it, never really spend the time to try to make sure that the processes are in place to understand that who's supposed to be using that information, how they're supposed to be using that information, and what should happen if any issues are kind of highlighted and things like that. So it's not just what kind of detection practices do you follow as far as what kind of protocols, what type of reports do you get from anybody, but also within your organization, what procedures do you have in place to use that information? Because too often you're dealing with a scenario where people are pressed for time, you've got people working 50 to 60 hours a week, and this is the last thing on their list, and they just don't have the time to do it. And so too often those processes are not in place that's really appropriate. And along those same lines, when we think about enforcement, as far as what is done and who is responsible for follow-up anytime a possible security breach is identified. I think too often organizations will go through, and when a security breach is identified, there's not really a set procedure in place. There's not clear lines of responsibility of who needs to do what and when. And so looking at those enforcement practices and helping people understand those processes is going to be a critical part of the work that we're doing here on this end. And so for this given provider, because they wanted us to focus solely on security, that's what we did. And I think that kind of gives you a little bit of a feel for the type of data, the type of processes that we'd be looking at when it comes to security. But on the other hand, an audit, as Tracy was describing, could be set up in such a way where instead of security being the focus, we're focused solely on, for example, the assessment development processes. And again, you kind of end up having that laser focus on just one component that the provider is concerned about, which allows you to get a little bit more detail and a little bit more in-depth into that one given thing. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of information. And I think with that, Tracy, I think I'll hand it back over to you to wrap up. I see we're getting close to 10 hours already.
Sure. Well, thanks, Drew. And hopefully through these 3 examples of work that we have conducted recently, hopefully that provides more concrete information about how it is that an audit can really be customized to the needs of a program and the ways in which an audit can vary from one program to the next. So a few quick highlights, things to reiterate before we wrap up. Really, an audit of a testing program is just an independent review of the work. So hopefully it seems a little less intimidating and scary. It's just the idea of getting a fresh set of eyes and unbiased viewpoints on either work that's been done or work that's planned to be done. Each audit is unique and customized to the individual program. There's not one way to do an audit. Instead, it's really important that an audit reflect and incorporate the specific needs and circumstances and goals of a program. The audit work itself focuses on comparing the work that's been done or is planned to be done to the relevant industry standards. So again, it's not a matter of the individual opinions of what's good and bad based on the reviewers themselves. It should be grounded in those standards and ideas of best practice. And at the end of the audit, the program should benefit through the identification of strengths and areas for improvement. So I think despite the fact that an audit really looks different depending on the program and depending upon the industry, I think these things are consistent across them all. One more point, again, Drew and I have referenced the standards that are used and relevant text for an audit. So this is just an example of some documents that Drew and I have used recently and grounded our work in education when it comes to audits. Certainly this is not a comprehensive list, but if you're interested in getting these references or knowing more about the references that are relevant to your industry, please feel free to follow up with us. We'd be happy to provide that for you. So thank you very much for attending today, and thank you for your time. Hopefully you found this to be informative. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Drew or myself with questions about the work that we've already done, or about potential work for the future, or questions about your program and how an audit may relate or be beneficial. So with that, Jana, I'll turn it back over to you. I think we're going to do questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to, we don't have any questions in the queue currently, so we'll just let folks have just take about a minute here. I do have one question that came in before the webinar that I'd like to ask of you both, and that was just a simple, what are the triggers that let me know when it's potentially time to conduct audits?
So I'll start, and Drew, please feel free to add to this. So I hate to be the person that says this, but I think it depends. And I think that there are a number of possible triggers. I think it could be that your program has been up and running and things seem to be going smoothly, but perhaps nothing has been updated in some time. That could be a good reason for an audit. It could be that you know, this happens in education where the content changes over time and evolves. And so if that's the case in your industry where the content that you're trying to assess changes over time, perhaps an audit is a good way to identify what aspects of your program need to be updated. And then, of course, there's always the less than pleasant situation where you're getting feedback that makes you think that you should go back and review what's been done. So those are a couple potential triggers. Drew, anything else you want to add?
I think that is the key areas, and I do think that I apologize that I'm using education examples for those who are not, but I think Tracy's example of as curriculum shift, as content shifts, you get to that point where you feel like your program is perhaps no longer up to date. And so I think those type of things are going to be critical. And if you've got programs that are not being kind of continually refreshed, it's a good idea to take a look at that. I think in the IT certification area, the age issue is much less of an issue because things are constantly changing and evolving. Whereas in education, you could have math tests or math programs that have been the same for 5 years or so. So I think those are the traditional triggers that we would point to. There are an increasing number of states who are developing kind of an audit process, if you will, and they're building it into their contracts where they are asking someone to kind of come in and consistently monitor what their primary vendor is doing as a way to kind of always keep this process going throughout the entire process. So that is happening as well.
Great. Thank you both, Tracy and Drew, for answering that question. And without any more questions, I want to just take the opportunity to once again say thank you for those of us who have joined us today. And thank you, Drew and Tracy, for sharing that valuable content with us. Once again, I just wanted to remind you as we close that our next webinar will be November the 10th, and we really, really hope that you'll consider joining us. So watch your email for an invite over the next couple of days. And with that, we are going to close this session of Alpine University. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.